The day I found the letters, the world didn't end in a fiery explosion or a sudden, dramatic collapse. It ended with a quiet, sickening thud in my chest, a sound no one else heard. It was the sound of 50 years of unwavering love, 50 years of shared laughter and whispered secrets, shattering into a million irreparable pieces. My Eleanor, my steadfast, beautiful Eleanor, had taken a monumental secret to her grave, a secret that wasn't just about betrayal, but about a life, a death, and a truth that would shake our small town to its very foundations. And I, Thomas, Big T Jefferson, the man who thought he knew her better than anyone, was about to uncover every agonizing, soul-destroying detail. Before we dive into a story that will twist your gut and make you question everything you thought you knew about love and loyalty, please take a moment to hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't already, and join me on this journey as I recount how a stack of faded letters became the blueprint for a revenge so profound, it didn't just right a personal wrong, but finally brought justice to the long-forgotten dead. The smell of grease and honest work was usually my comfort. For over 5 decades, my hands had known the intimate language of engines, their pistons, their gears, their subtle rhythms. I could diagnose a misfire by ear, coax life back into rusted metal with a touch. My garage, Jefferson's Auto, wasn't just a business, it was a sanctuary, a place where order could always be restored, where problems, however complex, eventually yielded to logic and skilled hands. My life, much like a well-tuned engine, had been robust, reliable, and predictable. Or so I thought. Eleanor was the gleaming chrome on that engine, the smooth ride, the unwavering compass that guided me. We met at a drive-in back in '68, her hair a cascade of auburn, her laugh a melody that snared my heart right then and there. We built a life, brick by painstaking brick, in this sleepy little town of Havenwood. We shared dreams, weathered storms, and raised our daughter Denise, a spitting image of her mother, with that same vibrant spirit. Eleanor was my confidant, my fiercest supporter, the quiet strength behind every success, every failure. Her presence was as fundamental to my existence as the air I breathed. To say I loved her would be an understatement. She was interwoven into the very fabric of my being. When she passed, it was like the main beam in my house had been suddenly removed. The silence in our home was deafening, a physical weight that pressed down on my chest. I'd walk into rooms expecting to see her, hear her hum a tune, or smell her apple pie baking. The grief was a constant companion, a dull ache that never truly subsided. I spent my days in the garage, losing myself in the familiar grit and grind, and my evenings in the armchair, tracing the lines of her face in old photographs. It was in one of those quiet, melancholic evenings, about 3 months after she was laid to rest, that I found them. Her worn, leather-bound Bible, a gift from her grandmother, lay on her bedside table, just as she'd left it. I picked it up, intending to place it back on the shelf, perhaps read a few of her favorite passages. As I did, a small, thick stack of envelopes slipped from between the brittle pages, landing softly on the rug. My heart gave a curious lurch, a strange mix of curiosity and something colder, something akin to dread. They were old, yellowed with age, and tied with a faded blue ribbon. Unsent letters, each addressed simply to J. I sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress still bearing the faint indentation of her body, and carefully untied the ribbon. My fingers trembled as I unfolded the first letter. Eleanor's familiar script, elegant and flowing, stared back at me. But the words were anything but familiar. "My dearest Jay," it began. My stomach dropped. "Each day without you is a hollow echo of what our life could have been. I look at Denise, our beautiful daughter, and I see so much of you in her eyes, a constant reminder of the love we shared, a love that burns brighter than any societal expectation or marital vow." The world tilted on its axis. Denise, our beautiful daughter, our love. Not mine. His. I reread the sentence, my eyes blurring, trying to make sense of the impossible. Denise was my daughter. We were married. 50 years? My heart, my soul, my very identity felt like it was being ripped open, exposed to a brutal, freezing wind. The grief I'd been carrying for Eleanor transmuted instantly, violently into something else entirely. A cold, searing fury, a profound, agonizing betrayal. I continued to read, my breath catching in my throat with each new revelation. The letters spoke of stolen moments, whispered promises, a passionate, illicit affair that had spanned years. They spoke of a love that defied convention, a love that had birthed our daughter. Each word was a dagger, twisting deeper into the wound. Eleanor, my rock, my confidant, had harbored such a profound deception, not just from me, but from Denise, from everyone. The letters described a complicated, desperate situation. Eleanor had loved me, she insisted, but Jay was her soulmate, the man she was truly meant to be with. The circumstances of their affair, the reasons for its secrecy, were hinted at but never fully explained. There was a pervasive sense of fear woven through her words, a fear of Jay's power, his influence, something unspoken that kept her tethered to her silence. I sat there for hours, the letters spread around me like fallen leaves, each one a testament to a life I hadn't known she lived. The silence of the house, once a symbol of my loneliness, now felt like a shroud, suffocating me with its unspoken truths. My mind raced, trying to reconcile the woman I loved, the woman I mourned, with this stranger who had woven such an intricate web of deceit. Who was Jay? How could she have kept this secret for so long? How could I have been so utterly blind? The raw, immediate pain of betrayal was a punch to the gut. It wasn't just the affair. It was the 50 years of a lie, the 50 years of raising a child who wasn't biologically mine, thinking she was. It was the complete rewrite of my entire history. My life as I knew it was a fabrication. Eleanor, the woman I adored, was gone, and in her place was a phantom, a keeper of devastating secrets. The comfort I had once found in the familiar rhythms of my life evaporated, leaving behind a vast, echoing emptiness. I tried to sleep that night, but my mind was a chaotic storm. Every memory of Eleanor, every shared glance, every touch, was now tainted, re-examined through the prism of this newfound betrayal. Was her smile genuine? Were her "I love yous" meant for me? Or was Jay always there, a ghost in our marriage bed? The questions gnawed at me, relentless, unforgiving. My hands, usually steady and precise, trembled uncontrollably. My stomach churned, a constant knot of nausea. The air felt thin, heavy, impossible to breathe. My grief for Eleanor hadn't vanished. It had morphed into something monstrous, something intertwined with rage and a desperate need for understanding. I needed answers. I needed to know the identity of Jay. And I needed to know the full extent of Eleanor's deception. My quiet, predictable life had just detonated, and I was left standing in the rubble, consumed by a silent, simmering fury that demanded satisfaction. This wasn't just about a broken heart anymore. This was about a shattered legacy, a stolen paternity, and a thirst for truth that had become an unquenchable fire within my soul. The first rays of dawn crept through the window, painting the room in soft hues, but for me, there was no light, only a deep, abiding darkness. My revenge, though I didn't know its shape yet, had begun. The days that followed were a blur of mechanical motion and internal turmoil. I went to the garage, worked on engines, changed oil, rotated tires, but my mind was a million miles away, replaying Eleanor's words, "Our beautiful daughter," over and over again. My hands moved on autopilot, muscles remembering the familiar tasks, but my focus was shattered. Customers would speak to me and I'd nod, give rote answers, my gaze distant, my thoughts consumed by the gnawing questions. Who was Jay? The name resonated in my mind like a discordant bell. I started my investigation with the quiet, methodical determination of a man used to diagnosing complex mechanical failures. This wasn't about fixing a carburetor. This was about dismantling a 50-year-old lie, piece by excruciating piece. I couldn't confide in anyone. Not my best friend Frank, who had known Eleanor and me since high school. Certainly not Denise, who still believed herself to be my biological daughter. The weight of this secret, now my secret, was immense, crushing. It felt like walking through thick mud, each step an effort, each breath heavy. I started small, with what I had. Eleanor's letters were a treasure trove of cryptic clues. They mentioned local landmarks, events, and names, always couched in veiled terms. I sifted through old photographs, pulling out boxes from the attic, blowing dust off forgotten albums. I looked for faces I didn't recognize, for men who might have lingered a little too long in Eleanor's presence, for smiles that seemed too intimate. It was agonizing, dissecting my own memories, tainting them with suspicion. Every happy moment, every loving glance was now subject to reevaluation, twisting the knife of betrayal deeper. I visited the town archives, ostensibly for research on old car models, but in reality, I was poring over church records, birth certificates, old census documents. I spoke to community elders, those with long memories and a fondness for gossip, asking casual questions about people from our past, listening intently for any mention of a J connected to Eleanor, any whisper of an indiscretion. It was like piecing together a mosaic of shadows and whispers. Slowly, painfully, a name began to surface, a name that sent a chill down my spine. Jeremiah Thorne. Thorne. The name itself was synonymous with power and ruthlessness in Havenwood's history. He'd owned half the businesses in town, including the sawmill and the general store back in the day. He was a man of immense influence, a man who got what he wanted. He'd died decades ago, but his shadow still loomed large over the town, spoken of in hushed tones, remembered for his iron will and his often unscrupulous dealings. Thorne. Could he be Jay? The pieces began to click into place, unsettlingly so. Eleanor had worked for him briefly as a young woman, before we were married, as a bookkeeper at his sawmill. I remembered her mentioning him, always with a peculiar, almost fearful deference. I'd attributed it to the respect one had for a powerful older employer. Now, I saw it differently. It was a respect laced with something far more complex, something akin to dread. As I dug deeper into Thorne's past, a more sinister layer of Eleanor's secret began to surface. I found an old newspaper clipping, faded and brittle, about the unsolved disappearance of a young woman named Sarah Jenkins. The article was from 40 years ago, a case that had haunted our community for decades, a mystery that had never been solved. Sarah, a vibrant young woman, had vanished without a trace after leaving a party at Thorne's lake cabin. The police investigation had gone cold, Thorne had been questioned, but nothing ever came of it. And then, it hit me. Eleanor. She had always been unusually quiet whenever the subject of Sarah came up. I'd attributed it to her general discomfort with tragedy, her sensitive nature. Now the memory of her subtle tension, the way her eyes would dart away, the almost imperceptible shiver, took on a terrifying new meaning. She knew. She had always known. The letters, once a testament to a forbidden love, now became clues in a different kind of mystery. Eleanor's words, filled with longing and regret for Thorne, also hinted at a secret burden, a fear of his wrath, and a cryptic mention of justice delayed. She'd written about the heavy price of silence and the shadows that clung to his name. What had I missed? How could I have been so utterly blind to the depths of her torment or her complicity? The thought was like a jolt of electricity, cold and terrifying. My wife, the woman I had cherished, the mother of my daughter, might not just have been a victim of a powerful man's charm, but a silent accomplice, a keeper of a darker secret than mere infidelity. The image of her, so loving and gentle, shattered further. I felt a visceral pang of nausea, a dizzying sense of disorientation. The world, already upside down, was now spinning out of control. I continued my relentless, solitary quest. I spent hours in the dusty archives of the local newspaper, poring over microfiche, the flickering light illuminating decades of forgotten headlines. I found old articles about Sarah Jenkins' disappearance, the subsequent, ultimately fruitless investigation. Thorne's name was mentioned in passing, always with an air of untouchability, a man above suspicion, a pillar of the community whose wealth and influence shielded him. There was a frustrating lack of detail, a sense that the case had been swept under the rug, deemed unsolvable. Every night I'd return home, the silence of the house pressing down on me, amplifying the turmoil in my mind. I barely ate, barely slept. My usually robust frame began to thin, my eyes hollowed. The revenge I sought was no longer just about Eleanor's betrayal. It had expanded, taken on a grim, desperate urgency. I wasn't just seeking personal vindication. I was pursuing justice for a forgotten victim, for a truth deliberately buried. One afternoon, while meticulously examining Eleanor's letters again, sprawled on the living room floor amidst old photos and newspaper clippings, a small detail leaped out at me. A date, subtly underlined, and a seemingly innocuous phrase about a fishing trip. It was a date that coincided precisely with Sarah Jenkins' disappearance. And the fishing trip was mentioned in conjunction with the cabin. A cold dread seeped into my bones. I remembered Thorne owned a secluded cabin by the lake, a place he rarely visited, a retreat for his business dealings. I also remembered Eleanor had once mentioned years ago a strange encounter near that cabin, a fleeting comment I had dismissed at the time. She'd been vague, troubled, attributing it to just a feeling, a shiver of unease she couldn't explain. Now I saw it differently. A chilling possibility began to form, solidifying into a horrific certainty. What if Eleanor hadn't just been a lover but a witness, or worse, an accomplice in silence? The thought was unbearable, yet it propelled me forward with a renewed, desperate resolve. The pain of her deception was now eclipsed by the terrifying implication of her complicity in something far more sinister. I had to know. I had to find out what happened to Sarah Jenkins, and I had to confront the full, brutal truth of my wife's hidden life. The struggle was not just against the past, but against the weight of my own shattered perception. My love for Eleanor, once absolute, was now fractured, replaced by a complex mix of anger, profound sorrow, and a strange, desperate need to understand the impossible position she must have found herself in. I was no longer grieving just a wife. I was grieving an entire life, a fabricated reality. And the only way out was through the darkness. Following the faint, terrible light of truth, the drive to Thorne's old cabin was fueled by a grim, unwavering resolve. The old pickup truck, usually a source of comfort, now felt like a war machine, carrying me towards an inevitable, painful confrontation with the past. The road, once familiar, seemed alien, each turn taking me deeper into a landscape that felt charged with unspoken secrets. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth, and an almost palpable sense of disuse and decay clung to the remote property. The cabin itself was dilapidated, paint peeling, windows boarded up, a testament to decades of neglect. It stood like a silent sentinel guarding a terrible secret. I got out of the truck, the crunch of gravel under my boots echoing in the oppressive silence. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of anticipation and dread. My hands, usually so steady, felt clumsy, fumbling. A cold sweat slicked my palms. This was it. The culmination of weeks of sleepless nights, of agonizing discoveries, of wrestling with the ghosts of the past. I circled the cabin, my mechanic's eye scanning, assessing, looking for any anomaly, any sign that someone had been here, anything out of place. The main cabin was locked tight, but I didn't feel the need to force entry. The letters had pointed me elsewhere, to a fishing trip, a seemingly innocuous detail. And fishing trips usually involved sheds, boats, equipment. Behind the cabin, partially obscured by overgrown bushes, stood a small rickety shed. Its door hung askew on rusty hinges, groaning softly in the faint breeze. The interior was dark, musty, filled with the ghosts of forgotten tools and the smell of rot. I scanned the dirt floor, Then the rough-hewn walls, the ceiling. Nothing immediately obvious. But then, my eyes, honed by years of diagnosing hidden problems, caught it. A subtle irregularity in the wooden floorboards near the back wall, almost imperceptible. One board seemed slightly cleaner than the others, a minuscule gap along one edge. It had been skillfully disguised, blending in with the general disarray, but to my experienced eye it screamed of deliberate concealment. I knelt, my knees protesting, and ran my fingers along the seam. It was loose. Very loose. With a grunt, I managed to pry it up. Beneath it, nestled in the damp earth, was a rusty metal box, the kind you'd use for fishing tackle or old tools. My breath hitched. This was it. My hands trembled as I pulled it out, brushing away the clinging soil. Inside, carefully preserved against the ravages of time and damp, were the answers I had so desperately sought and so profoundly dreaded. The first item I pulled out was a small leather-bound diary, its pages brittle with age. Sarah Jenkins was etched on the front in delicate script. My heart ached, a sharp, profound sadness for the vibrant young woman whose life had been so cruelly cut short, whose memory had lingered as a cold case for decades. Next, a locket, tarnished but recognizable, a silver heart engraved with initials, S.J. It was the locket Sarah was known to wear, the one mentioned in the old newspaper articles never found. And then, a stack of papers, folded meticulously. The first sheet was a confession, written in Thorne's unmistakable, sprawling hand. It detailed the circumstances of Sarah's death, a struggle, an accident, fueled by alcohol and his own volatile temper, his subsequent panic, the cover-up, the burial, deep in the woods, not far from the cabin, a location only vaguely described, but enough for a determined search party. He'd meticulously outlined how he'd manipulated the initial investigation, using his influence to deflect suspicion, to make the case go cold. I read Thorne's words, a cold rage seeping into my veins. He described Sarah as hysterical, unreasonable, trying to leave, threatening to expose his illicit dealings, his violent temper. He hadn't meant to kill her, he claimed, but his words dripped with a chilling lack of remorse, a sense of entitlement and self-preservation. He was merely protecting his reputation, his power. My hands clenched, crumpling the edges of the paper. Beneath Thorne's confession, there was one final unsent letter. This one, addressed to Thorne, was in Eleanor's hand. It was dated years after the affair, years after Sarah's disappearance, long after Thorne was safely dead. In it, Eleanor pleaded with him, her words laced with anguish, begging him to confess. She hinted at her knowledge, her deep regret for her silence, her torment. "The weight of this secret is crushing me, Jeremiah," she had written. "For Sarah's sake, for the peace of your own soul, confess. Justice delayed is justice denied." She had kept it, perhaps, as a desperate attempt at leverage, a silent protest, or as a testament to her own tormented conscience, a record of her impossible struggle. My mind reeled. The pieces, once scattered and fragmented, now coalesced into a horrifying, complete picture. Eleanor hadn't just been a lover. She had been a witness, a silent keeper of a terrible secret, trapped by Thorne's power, his threats, and perhaps her own complicated feelings for him. Her fear of Thorne's wrath in her earlier letters now made chilling sense. She had lived with this burden, this unspeakable knowledge for decades, carrying it to her grave. My heart ached, a complex blend of anger at Eleanor's deception, profound sadness for Sarah, and a strange, grudging understanding of the impossible position Eleanor must have found herself in, caught between the man she loved, the father of her child, and the terrible truth of a murder. She had chosen silence, a decision that haunted her, that defined her later years in ways I could never have comprehended. My Eleanor, the woman I thought I knew, was a far more complex, tragic figure than I had ever imagined. I carefully collected the evidence. Sarah's diary, the locket, Thorne's confession, Eleanor's final, unsent plea. Each item felt heavy, imbued with the weight of stolen lives and buried truths. This was not just a personal revenge anymore. This was a mission to right a decades-old wrong, to bring a killer to justice, even from beyond the grave. The ride back to Havenwood was different. The silence in the truck was no longer oppressive, but charged with a new purpose. My mind was clear, focused. The emotional whirlwind had settled into a steely resolve. I knew what I had to do. This wasn't just about me, or Eleanor, or even Denise. This was about Sarah. This was about justice. I went straight to the authorities, the small-town sheriff, Old Man Jenkins, who remembered the Sarah Jenkins case with a tired sigh. I walked into his office, the rusty box clutched in my hand, and laid out my findings with a quiet dignity that belied the storm raging within me. His eyes, initially skeptical, widened as he examined the diary, the locket, and finally, Thorne's confession. The evidence was irrefutable. Even decades later, Thorne, long dead, was finally implicated in Sarah Jenkins's disappearance and murder, bringing a measure of closure to a cold case that had festered in the community's collective memory. The news spread like wildfire through Havenwood. The reopening of the Sarah Jenkins case, the discovery of Thorne's guilt, the shocking implication of Eleanor's long-held secret, it was all anyone could talk about. For me, the public vindication was secondary. The real revenge, the real justice, was the truth finally seeing the light of day. But there was one more painful truth to confront. Denise. This was the hardest part, far harder than unearthing the physical evidence. The thought of shattering her world, of exposing her mother's profound secret, of revealing that the man she believed to be her father was not, after all, her biological parent. It twisted my gut, but I couldn't keep this from her. She deserved the truth, however agonizing. This was a truth that defined her, her lineage, her mother's life. And I, her father in every way that mattered, had to be the one to deliver it. I called her, my voice strained, asking her to come over. She heard the tremor in my voice, the unusual gravity, and arrived quickly, her face etched with concern. We sat in the living room, the same room where Eleanor and I had shared so many quiet evenings, where Denise had grown up. The unsent letters, Thorne's confession, and Eleanor's final plea were laid out on the coffee table between us, a stark, undeniable testament to the complex, tragic truth. The conversation was agonizing, a landscape of tears, disbelief, and a raw sense of betrayal that mirrored my own. Denise stared at the documents, her face pale, her hands trembling as she read. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "No, not Mom. Not you, Dad." Her identity, her understanding of her family, her entire world was shaken to its core. The tears streamed down her face, silent rivers of pain. I held her hand, my own heart aching with a renewed profound sadness for the woman I had loved, for the daughter I adored, and for the life that had been a beautiful lie. I recounted Eleanor's desperate plea in her final unsent letter to Thorne, emphasizing her mother's internal struggle, her fear, and her eventual, albeit silent, pursuit of justice by preserving the truth. I explained that Eleanor, in her own flawed way, had tried to do what was right, even if it meant living with an unbearable secret, a secret that had tormented her for decades. I told Denise that Eleanor's silence wasn't a malicious act, but born of fear, of a dangerous man's power, and a desperate, flawed attempt to protect her. I told her that Eleanor had loved me, and she had loved Denise fiercely, irrevocably. I told her that nothing, absolutely nothing, could change the fact that I was her father, her dad, the one who had raised her, loved her, and would always, always be there for her. The process wasn't a sudden, cathartic burst of forgiveness. It was a slow, arduous process of understanding and acceptance. Denise, looking at me, the man who had loved her, raised her, and now, with unwavering courage, brought her this devastating truth, saw not just a wronged husband, but a man of profound integrity, a man who chose truth and justice, even when it meant tearing open old wounds. My own pain, my own betrayal was still there, a dull ache in my chest, but seeing the turmoil in Denise's eyes, the profound grief, made my own feel somehow secondary. My revenge, my quest for truth, had brought justice to Sarah Jenkins, but it had also brought a new kind of, albeit painful, honesty to my relationship with Denise. The days and weeks that followed were a whirlwind. The sheriff's office, armed with Thorne's confession and the physical evidence, launched a full-scale investigation, despite Thorne being long dead. Forensics were brought in, and though the details of Sarah's burial location and Thorne's confession were vague, the area around the cabin, specifically the dense woods he described, was meticulously searched. It took days, but they found her. Sarah Jenkins, after 40 years, was finally brought home. The community of Havenwood was in an uproar. The revelation of Thorne's guilt, the cold case finally solved, sent shockwaves through every household. People who had long admired Thorne's legacy, who had dismissed Sarah's disappearance as a sad mystery, were forced to confront the dark underbelly of their town's history. Whispers turned into open discussions, then into outrage. The powerful, untouchable Jeremiah Thorne, once revered, was now reviled. His name, once synonymous with prosperity, became a byword for treachery and murder. His carefully constructed legacy crumbled into dust, exposed for the rotten foundation it truly was. That, for me, was a form of justice, a satisfying, albeit bittersweet revenge. The truth, like a persistent weed, had finally broken through the concrete of lies. For Denise, the fallout was more personal, more devastating. The news of her biological father being Jeremiah Thorne, a murderer, hit her like a physical blow. The gossip, the stares, the uncomfortable silences when she walked into the grocery store or church, it was all a constant reminder of the upheaval in her life. She wrestled with her identity, with the legacy of her mother's choices, and with the shocking realization that the man she had always called Dad was not her blood, yet was more her father than any biological connection could ever define. Our conversations were frequent, long, and often difficult. There were still tears, still moments of raw anger and confusion. She questioned everything: her mother's love, her own existence, the very foundations of her understanding of the world. But through it all, I remained steadfast. I reiterated my love for her, my unwavering commitment to being her father. I reminded her of Eleanor's struggle, her tormented conscience, her desperate silent fight for justice. I told her that Eleanor, in preserving the evidence, in writing that final unsent letter, had, in her own flawed way, chosen truth over convenience, even at immense personal cost. It was a slow healing process, like mending a deeply fractured bone. But slowly, painstakingly, our bond began to rebuild, strengthened by a new kind of honesty, a shared grief, and an unbreakable love. Denise started to see Eleanor not as a villain, but as a tragically complex woman caught in an impossible web, making imperfect choices born of fear and a desperate love. She began to understand that love, in its purest form, transcends biology. Looking at me, the man who had loved her, raised her, and brought her this painful truth with such unwavering courage, she saw a profound integrity that solidified my place in her heart. Thomas, Big T, Jefferson, eventually found a new kind of peace. The world didn't return to its pre-discovery predictability, but a different kind of order settled into my soul. I couldn't erase the past, but I had untangled its knots, brought a killer to light, and in doing so, allowed a different kind of truth to emerge, one where justice, however delayed, finally found its way, and where the complicated, imperfect love of my life was seen at last in its full, tragic complexity. I continued to work on engines. The familiar rhythm of wrench and grease became once again a comfort, a meditative ritual. Each bolt tightened, each part replaced, was a small act of restoration, mirroring the slow, deliberate mending of my own life. The garage, Jefferson's auto, remained my sanctuary, but now it held not just the ghosts of broken machines, but the echoes of a past finally brought into the light. I spent more time with Denise, rebuilding our bond with honesty and shared grief. We talked about Eleanor, not just the beautiful memories, but the painful truths, piecing together the narrative of a woman who was both loving wife and tormented secret keeper. We visited Eleanor's grave, and this time, the grief felt different. Heavier perhaps with the weight of her choices, but also lighter, unburdened by the crushing weight of unspoken lies. One quiet evening, as the sun began to set, painting the garage in hues of orange and purple, I sat on my old workbench, a wrench resting in my lap. I looked at an old framed photograph of Eleanor, her youthful smile radiant, a faint smile playing on my own lips. She had been a mystery, a force of nature, and in her own flawed way, a keeper of secrets and ultimately, a seeker of justice. The unsent letters had brought pain, yes, excruciating, soul-shattering pain, but they had also brought truth. And with truth eventually came a difficult but real peace. My revenge wasn't loud or vengeful. It was quiet, resolute, and ultimately it brought a measure of healing, not just for me, but for the long-forgotten dead. The echoes of betrayal still linger, of course. Some scars never truly fade, but the constant suffocating pressure of the unknown is gone. The truth, however harsh, has set me free in a way I never thought possible. Eleanor's story, once a beautiful, simple romance, transformed into a Greek tragedy, a testament to the complexities of love, fear, and the enduring power of secrets. I learned that even in the most profound betrayals, there can be a glimmer of redemption, a desperate attempt at justice, however flawed. And I learned that a father's love, true love, is not defined by blood, but by unwavering presence, by sacrifice, and by the courage to face even the most agonizing truths, together. If this story of love, betrayal, and delayed justice resonated with you, please hit the like button. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever uncovered a truth that changed everything you thought you knew? And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into complex human stories. Until next time, remember that the pursuit of truth, however difficult, is often the most profound revenge of all.